Okay, so in this video we're going to be looking at Query Selector and Query Selector all within JavaScript, and following on from the last video where we used getElementById, this method is going to allow us to select first of all elements on the page using a more complicated querying system like CSS selectors, and we'll take a look at an example of this obviously. Not only that, but it will also allow us to use the Query Selector All method, which allow us to select more than one element on a page using a selector. So that's useful for when we need to select lots of different things at once. So let's just recap and take a look at how we might select elements if they were, for example, within a navigation system. So using getElementById, and we'll see how this just doesn't work as well as we want it to, and just the fact that it's not going to be appropriate for this kind of selection. So we'll go ahead and we'll build this navigation, we'll build the markup, and we'll talk about the markup a little bit, and then we'll look at how we might want to select each of these elements within our navigation system. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a nav tag, and within this I'm going to create an unordered list, and then within each of the within this unordered list I'm going to create list items. So hopefully this markup is recognizable. I'm going to type home for the first one. I'm going to give the hrefs a hash. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this down a couple of times and just create some fake website links, so about us and contact. So we've now got a navigation which contained within it is an unordered list, and then within this there are 3 list items. Now this is really important that we understand that there are 3 child elements to this UL. There's 1 child element to this nav, which is UL, and then inside of each of these LIs they have 1 child element. So what we're going to do is, the first thing we're going to do is use not Query Selector or getElementById, and we'll be able to see how this is just really no good or less effective for this kind of thing. So with getElementById, we obviously create a variable to store the element that we're selecting, and we use obviously the document object, and we say getElementById. Now within this we need to specify the name of an ID. As we mentioned in the last video, and as should be knowledge, within within HTML, you can only use an ID once on a page. You can use it twice, but it should only be used once on a page. So if we wanted to select all of these items, for example, and list through them, how would we do that? Well, we could of course provide an ID on here, for example, and call that nav, and then we could say getElementById nav. Now let's go ahead and just take a look at what this might involve. So we'll go ahead and we will say element, and this shows us that we've got an unordered list here. Now we can use under element, we can do things like element dot child nodes, so that will give us all the child nodes in here that we have. So we've got each of the LIs here, and we've got some other bits here, but really this is not as easy to work with, and it's not as effective. There are much better ways to be able to select each of these list items within this unordered list, and there are much more flexible ways to do this, and that's using Query Selector and Query Selector All. Now we'll go ahead and look at the syntax of this. We'll go ahead and get rid of getElementById. We don't need to use this for now, because firstly this involves us putting an ID onto this UL, which isn't really desirable. We shouldn't have to do this. Instead, what we're going to use is we're going to use document.querySelector. Now what this will do is it allows us to provide a CSS style selector to this method, which allows us to chain and get elements as we need them based on a selector. Now, if you've not worked with CSS before, this is basically going to be how you would define style rules on items like nav, ul, li. So for example, if I just create an inline style tag here, I'll show you how I might style each of these anchors. So I might go nav, ul, li, a, and then I might say font weight bold, for example. So what that's going to do is it's going to change each of these bold, and we've targeted each one of these. Don't worry about this error that's appeared. That's just because I haven't filled in the contents of this query selector method. Okay, so now what we're going to do is, styles aside, that was just an example, we're going to go ahead and we're going to select the first anchor of this navigation system, if you like. So I'm basically going to pass through the selector that I would use in CSS, so nav ULLIA. So makes sense. Let's go ahead and look at what happens here. So we've got no errors, perfect. When I type element, you can now see that I'm returned with the element of the first navigation item. Now I can do things like element dot inner text equals home page, for example. So I can do everything that I would normally be able to do with an element that's returned using the get element by ID method. I can do exactly the same with document.query selector. Now in this case, what I actually want to do by the end of this video is have the ability to loop through all of these items here and output the names and output the hrefs. So for example, if this was home.html, or in actual fact just a /, and this was about.html, and this was contact.html, all of which don't exist, but that doesn't matter. What we could do is we can use Query Selector all. Now the difference between this and Query Selector is this is going to return multiple items. So if you only need to use a Query Selector, by Query Selector I mean this query here, to get just one item, use Query Selector. If you need to get multiple items, use Query Selector all. Now just to go on to a sort of side talk about Query Selector, I'm on a website called caniuse.com, which provides really good information about whether you can use certain JavaScript APIs, in which browsers, CSS elements, CSS rules, or CSS properties. And in this case, I'm looking at this for Query Selector, which relates to Query Selector and Query Selector all. And you can actually see here the browser support. So if I scroll up, you can see that we've got Chrome is fully supported all the way through, so we never need to worry about Chrome. With Firefox, we've got version 2 and 3 not supported, but we don't really need to worry about this because it's highly unlikely that people are going to be running a version of Firefox 26 or 25 versions back, considering that Firefox will automatically update itself. Well, not automatically, but it will always prompt users to update. With things like Opera as well, there's probably no need to worry about versions 13 and 14 back. But you can see here, generally, there is very good support across mobile devices as well, for pretty much from the first version that's available as supported. The only problem with this is that you're looking at no support for IE7, IE6 and IE5. Now you can see if I hover over this, we've got a label here that says not supported but has a polyfill available. Now a polyfill is a piece of code, usually JavaScript, that allows you to basically fake the functionality of Query Selector. In this case, polyfills are available for other CSS and JavaScript functionality that isn't available in other browsers as well, but in this case we can actually download a polyfill that's available. So while we're working in here, we're using Query Selector all. I'm currently running the latest version of Chrome, and this is working fine. But if you go to a browser like IE7 or 6, particularly 7, because most people there are a significant percentage of people still using Internet Explorer 7, unfortunately, then you'll have problems with this method and it simply won't work. So use a polyfill and have a Google around for that, and you'll find something that simulates the functionality of Query Selector and Query Selector all. So that aside, just bearing in mind browser support, it's good to always check browser support, but we'll go ahead and close that off for now because we're working with the latest version of Chrome. Okay, so now that we've used Query Selector all instead of just Query Selector, let's take a look at how this differs when I output element. And you can see here that we've actually got an array signified by the square brackets of items that have been selected by this Query Selector, and you can see that they're highlighted as I hover over them. Now what we can do with this is we can do things like element.count. So, oh, sorry, dot length, not dot count. And that will give us the amount of items that have been returned. So again, we have inherited them from the object prototype. We have the length property available, which gives us the amount of elements that have been returned. So we can do everything we need in that respect. We can also then use something like element 0, and then we can do something like dot inner text. So we can modify that as well using the indexes to access each element. And we can of course loop over them as well, and that's what we're going to be doing in just a moment. So what we'll do down here is we will perform a quick check. Again, I'm using globals here. This is just for testing purposes, so please make sure you're using things within an object namespace. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to say navigation. So I'm going to say if navigation dot length, that's just checking that we have selected all of our navigation items. I'm going to say for item in navigation, and then down here I'm going to create a new variable called item, and I'm going to say for so I'm going to say item. In fact, we don't really need to do this because all we're doing is really console logging out for example purposes. I'm going to say navigation item, and what that will do is that will just log out to the console each of these items here. So it just basically shows each of these. And what we'll now do is we'll say dot. What were we going to do? We're going to get the text, so we say dot text. So when I refresh now, you can see that we've got home, about us, and contact. And we also then can say plus space plus navigation. In fact, we will put this into a variable in itself. So I'm going to say var item equals, or var I equals navigation item. So I dot text and I dot let's say get attribute href. And let's put a hyphen in there. So what that's now going to do is it's going to loop through each of our navigation items. We're going to assign the current item that we're at in the current position to the variable I, and then we're going to get the text separated by a hyphen, get the href attribute. And what that'll do is that'll just output home, home /home about.html, home contact.html. Now you can see here that we've got object 3 as no method get attribute. Let's just take a look at why that might be. So if I output var navigation, we can see that we've got 3 items. So why is this happening? Well, let's just go and have a look at what's sort of going on here. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to console.log. Instead of doing this for now, I'm going to console.log I and see what we get out. So let's go ahead and refresh. Now what you can see is we've got these 3 items here, which are the anchors, each of these anchors, like these here. And then the final property is the length. So we actually are iterating over this length, which we don't want to do. So what we actually need to do is examine why this is such a problem. The reason it's a problem is that it's iterating over each of the elements properties rather than the values that we see when we log it. Now this is fine when we're creating arrays for ourselves, it doesn't matter too much, but what's actually happening here is that we are iterating over the length property, and this is a sort of misuse of this for loop. Now what we want to do is, earlier in the series we talked about why we should use a for loop, as in not a for in loop, to loop over the items of an array. So what we can do here is we can say for, we can go ahead and create a variable, so for example 0, say while x is less than or equal to navigation.length, and then we can say x equals x plus 1. So let's just tidy this up a little bit. I'm going to say navigation length, and I'm going to say that is equal to navigation.length, and I'm going to say if navigation length, then navigation length, and then that's it. So now what I want to do is, instead of I being a navigation item, I want that to be navigation X. Now what's going to happen is when I go ahead and refresh, you'll see that, yep, sorry, that should be less than, not less than or equal to. All that's going to now do is it's going to loop 3 times. So it's going to access the first 3 elements of this array, not the length property. So we're not actually iterating over the properties here. We're just iterating over the items. There's no way that we can access the length property using this method. So therefore, any other properties of this array which have been inherited will be ignored. So this will be the correct way to iterate over this item. Or this navigation variable that we've created. So that's it. We've examined Query Selector All. We've looked at support for it. We've selected items from a navigation system, and then we've just output them into the console.